The price of a father's sin is not paid in coin, but in the flesh and blood of his daughter, sold under an unforgiving son. It was a debt she never incurred, yet one she was forced to pay, her future traded for a ghost's transgression. She was to become a line item on a ledger, a soul bartered to balance the scales of a town that called itself redemption. But justice is a strange and twisted thing, and sometimes it arrives in the form of a quiet man who understands the true cost of being an outsider, a man who saw not an object to be owned, but a life to be saved. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The dust of redemption was a living thing. It coated the sills of every window, settled in the lines of every face, and clung to the hem of Alara's worn dress like a second skin. It was the grit of memory, the fine-milled powder of every hope that had ever withered and died in this valley. She could feel it in her lungs with every shallow breath, a constant suffocating reminder of where she was and what she had become. Her world had shrunk to the four walls of the small room above the general store, a space that felt more like a cage with each passing day. From her window, she watched the town move in its predictable rhythms, a slow, merciless tide of judgment. The women who clutched their purses tighter as she passed, the men whose gazes were a mixture of pity and predatory appraisal. They were all part of the same suffocating whole. They were the jury that had convicted her long before any gavel fell. Her father's crime, a thing of whispers and shadows, had become her own. He had been a man of grand promises and hollow words, a specter who had gambled away not just his own future, but hers as well. He had stolen from the town's coffers, they said, a betrayal that had left a wound in the community's pride, and now they intended to carve their pound of flesh from her. The concept was medieval, barbaric, yet cloaked in the righteous language of settlement and restitution. She was not a person, she was an asset to be liquidated. The silence in her room was a roar, a constant companion filled with the things she could no longer say. It was filled with the ghost of her mother's lullabies and the phantom weight of her father's hand on her shoulder, a hand that had promised protection, but had only delivered ruin. She traced the rim of a chipped porcelain cup, a relic from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. It was smooth, cool, and indifferent, a small, solid thing in a world that had dissolved into chaos. This town, with its pious pronouncements and its steeple reaching for a heaven it so clearly misunderstood, had decided her fate. They would put her on a block under that same unforgiving sun that baked the very life from the earth, and they would sell her. They would sell her dignity, her future, her very name, all to settle a debt that was never hers. And as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the dust-choked sky in hues of bruised purple and angry orange, Alara knew that she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The silence was her only shield, her stillness her only rebellion. But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that it would not be enough. The memory of her father was a fractured mosaic, pieces of which she would turn over in her mind in the dead of night. It was never the memory of a criminal, not in the way the town saw him. It was the memory of a man with eyes full of distant horizons, his hands always sketching maps of imaginary fortunes on the dusty tabletop. He smelled of pine and cheap whiskey, a scent that was both comforting and a precursor to disappointment. He would sit her on his knee and speak of cities made of gold, of rivers teeming with pearls, of a life so grand it made their cramped existence in redemption feel like a temporary inconvenience. "Just a little longer, Alara Bell," he would whisper, his voice a low, hopeful rumble. "Just one more turn of the card and we'll be free of this place." He was a weaver of beautiful, fragile dreams, and for a time she had lived inside them, believing in the inevitable dawn he promised. But the dawn never came. Instead, the sheriff had arrived, his shadow falling long and dark across their threshold. She remembered the metallic clink of his spurs on the floorboards, a sound that had severed her childhood from whatever came next. He had not been unkind, not exactly. Sheriff Brody was a man who operated within the rigid lines of the law, a man whose compassion had been worn down to a nub by years of dealing with the town's quiet desperations. He had spoken to her in a low, measured tone, explaining the situation as if it were a simple matter of arithmetic. Her father was gone, vanished like smoke in the wind, and in his wake, a chasm of debt. The town's founding families, the very people whose fortunes he had promised to multiply, had been left with empty hands. "It's a matter of honor, you understand," the sheriff had said, his eyes avoiding hers, focusing instead on a crack in the wall. "The debt must be paid. The town charter is very specific on matters of significant public fraud." The words were cold, sterile, devoid of the human tragedy they described. He spoke of an archaic clause, a relic of a harsher time, one that allowed for the forfeiture of assets and indentured settlement by a debtor's next of kin. He was talking about her. He was talking about selling her. The mosaic of her father shattered then, the loving images replaced by the sharp, cutting reality of his betrayal. His dreams had not been for her. They had been for him. His escape had been his alone. He had not just left her behind. He had tethered her to his failure, leaving her as collateral for a world of his own making. In the suffocating silence that followed the sheriff's departure, Ilara understood. The promises were lies, the horizons were mirages, and she was the price for it all. The days leading up to the auction were a slow, methodical stripping away of her humanity. It began with the visit from Mrs. Gable, the mayor's wife, a woman whose charity was as sharp and cold as a shard of glass. She brought with her a dress of plain gray wool, the color of ash. "It is important to look presentable," she'd said, her voice thin and reedy, "to show that you understand the gravity of your situation, that you are penitent." Ilara wanted to scream that there was nothing to be penitent for, that the sin was not hers to carry. But the words caught in her throat, strangled by a profound sense of powerlessness. She was no longer a person to be heard, but an object to be prepared for viewing. The dress was coarse against her skin, a uniform of shame. Next came the town doctor, a man whose hands were clammy and whose gaze lingered too long. He was there to pronounce her fit for labor, a clinical assessment that felt like a violation. He checked her teeth as if she were livestock, felt the bones in her wrists and ankles, and made notes on a small pad. He hummed a tuneless, self-satisfied melody as he worked, utterly oblivious to the silent terror that was screaming inside her. Each touch was a desecration, a confirmation of her new status as property. She stood there, a statue of forced compliance, her mind retreating to a small, dark corner where she could still be whole, where she could still be herself. The town pastor followed, a man whose piety was a performance. He spoke to her of redemption, of paying one's dues in the eyes of God and man. He quoted scripture about the sins of the father, twisting holy words into a justification for this cruelty. His words were meant to be a balm, but they were salt in an open wound. He saw her not as a soul to be saved, but as a moral lesson to be made an example of. His sermon was for the town, a way to sanctify their collective act of barbarism, to convince themselves that what they were doing was not monstrous, but righteous. Through it all, Ilara remained silent. Her silence became her armor. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tears nor the fire of her anger. She let their words, their touches, their judgments wash over her, preserving the small, inviolable core of her being. She held on to the memory of her mother's face, a soft, warm image that stood in stark contrast to the hard, cold faces that now surrounded her. It was a desperate, defiant act of self-preservation. In the cold gray dress, pronounced fit and prayed over, she was ready for the block. She was no longer Ilara. She was the town's penance, a living sacrifice to the god of their own greed and hypocrisy. He arrived as the town was gathering, a silent figure on a powerful buckskin horse, materializing from the heat haze of the plains as if summoned by the tension itself. He did not ride into the center of town with the swagger of the other ranchers, but skirted the edges, his movements fluid and economical. He was a man who seemed to take up no more space than was necessary. The townspeople noticed him immediately. A current of whispers and uneasy glances followed his path. He was Comanche, a fact announced by the fine beadwork on his leather vest, and the two long braids that framed a face carved from resolute stillness. In a town like Redemption, where conformity was a shield, his very presence was a challenge. He was Kale, He dismounted with a quiet grace, tethering his horse not with the others at the main hitching post, but to a solitary rail near the blacksmith's forge, a place of fire and iron. He stood apart, an island of calm in the growing sea of nervous excitement. From her window, Ilara watched him. The other men in town, the landowners and merchants who would soon be bidding on her life, were loud, expansive, their laughter and talk filling the air with a coarse bravado. They postured and preened, their wealth and status on full display. Cale was the antithesis of all that. He was still, his gaze watchful and patient. He surveyed the scene not with the acquisitive eye of a buyer, but with the assessing glance of a hunter or a survivor. There was an ancient patience in his posture, a deep-rooted connection to the land that the other men, for all their deeds and titles, could never possess. They sought to own the land. He seemed to be a part of it. His presence was a disquieting note in the town's carefully composed symphony of self-righteousness. The other men looked at him with a mixture of fear and derision, the reflexive prejudice of those whose power was built on the exclusion of others. They saw a savage, an outsider, a threat. Ilara saw something different. Through the dusty pane of glass, across the chasm of her despair, she saw a solitude that mirrored her own. He was a man who did not belong, a man who had clearly made his peace with that fact. In his quiet defiance, in his refusal to be cowed by their collective judgment, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in weeks, a strange, inexplicable kinship. He was not one of them, and in that moment, that simple fact made him the only person in the entire town who didn't seem like a monster. He was a mystery, a dark and silent question mark on the edge of her tragedy, and she could not look away. The sun was high and merciless, beating down on the hastily constructed wooden platform in the center of the town square. It bleached the color from the world, leaving only harsh light and sharp shadows. Ilara was led from the store by the sheriff, his grip on her arm firm but not intentionally cruel. A simple act of official procedure. The walk was the longest of her life. The faces in the crowd blurred into a single, monstrous entity, a hydra of leering eyes and whispering mouths. The air was thick with the scent of sweat, dust, and cheap perfume, a nauseating combination that made her stomach clench. She was guided up the 3 steps to the platform, each one a step further away from the person she used to be. The auctioneer, a portly man named Biddle with a booming voice and a stained waistcoat, greeted her arrival with a theatrical flourish. He was a showman, and this was his stage. He held up his hands for silence, a practiced smile plastered on his face. "Friends, neighbors," he began, his voice echoing unnaturally in the sudden quiet. "We are gathered here today not in anger, but in the spirit of justice, to right a wrong, to settle a significant and painful debt owed to this fine community." His words were a balm for the town's conscience, turning a vile act into a civic ceremony. Ilara stood beside him, her eyes fixed on a loose floorboard at her feet. She focused on its splintered grain, the way the light caught its weathered surface, making it the only real thing in a world that had become a waking nightmare. She would not look at them. She would not give them her gaze. "And now," Biddle continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone, "the asset, a young woman strong and healthy, as certified by our own Dr. Adams, fit for domestic service, farm labor, a versatile and valuable addition to any household." He gestured toward her as if presenting a prize sow at a county fair. The first bid came from a farmer on the edge of the crowd, a low, almost insulting offer that was met with a few scattered snickers. $5, he shouted, his voice thick with a kind of gleeful cruelty. Another man, a merchant she recognized from the store, countered with 10. The bidding climbed in small, humiliating increments. Each number called out was a fresh lash, a new brand on her soul. They were not bidding on her labor. They were bidding on her humiliation. They were putting a price on her despair. Her hands, tied loosely in front of her, were trembling. She clenched them, digging her nails into her palms, the small, sharp pain a welcome anchor in the swirling chaos of her mind. The sun beat down, and the auctioneer's voice became a drone, a meaningless litany of numbers that quantified her worthlessness. This was it. This was the final degradation, the absolute bottom. There was no escape, no hope, just the slow, agonizing process of being sold, piece by piece to the highest, cruelest bidder. The bidding began to slow, the initial flurry of spiteful, low-ball offers giving way to the more serious contenders. The farmer dropped out, then the merchant. Soon, only two men remained. One was the banker, Mr. Harris, a man whose face was a mask of cold calculation. The other was a landowner from the northern valley, a man named Silas Croft, known for his harsh temper and the high turnover of his hired hands. Croft's eyes were small and dark, and they roamed over her with an owner's possessive glare that made her skin crawl. The price had reached $80, a sum that felt both impossibly large and pitifully small. It was the price of a good horse. The crowd was silent now, the performative aspect of the auction replaced by a tense transactional reality. This was the final act. Harris, ever the pragmatist, hesitated. He adjusted his spectacles, weighing the cost against the utility. Croft, however, looked triumphant. He puffed out his chest, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. 85, he called out, his voice laced with victory. He was not just buying a servant. He was buying power, buying a story to tell about how he'd acquired the swindler's daughter. He was purchasing a trophy. The auctioneer turned to the banker. Do I hear 90? Harris gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He was out. A wave of cold dread washed over Alara, so intense it almost buckled her knees. Silas Croft. Of all the men in this town, it had to be him. She could already feel the bleakness of her future under his roof. A life of endless drudgery and casual cruelty. $85 going once, Biddle boomed, raising his small wooden gavel. Going twice. Despair was a physical thing. A black hood slipping over her head, suffocating the last vestiges of light. This was her fate. This was the end of her story. Sold. But the final word was cut off. A voice, quiet yet carrying with an undeniable authority, sliced through the tension. $1,000. The words fell into the silence like stones into a still pond. Every head in the square swiveled in unison. Kyle, the Comanche rancher, had stepped forward from the shadows of the blacksmith's forge. He stood there, impassive, his gaze fixed not on Alara but on the stunned auctioneer. The crowd was utterly silent, a collective gasp hanging in the air. $1,000 was not a bid. It was a declaration. It was more than the original debt. It was a fortune. Croft's face, which had been a mask of triumph, was now a canvas of stunned fury and disbelief. Biddle, the auctioneer, stammered, his professional composure completely shattered. I don't... Kyle took another step forward, his hand moving to a leather pouch at his belt. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. The debt is $1,000. I am paying it, in full. He didn't say he was buying her. He said he was paying the debt. The distinction was subtle, but it hung in the air with the weight of a covenant. He wasn't participating in their disgusting game. He was ending it. The transaction was completed in a state of stunned silence. Kyle did not count out the coins with any flourish. He simply upended the heavy leather pouch onto the auctioneer's table. Gold and silver spilled out, a breathtaking cascade that seemed to mock the petty squabbling that had preceded it. The sound of the coins, a rich, solid chime, was the only sound in the square. Sheriff Brody, his face a mixture of confusion and a strange, grudging respect, untied Alara's hands. The coarse rope fell away, leaving red, chafed marks on her wrists. Kyle did not look at her. He simply nodded once toward his horse and began to walk. For a moment, Alara was frozen, rooted to the platform. Her mind couldn't process the sudden, violent shift in her reality. One minute she was bound for Silas Croft's personal hell. The next she was, what? Free? Indebted to a silent stranger? She looked at the faces in the crowd, their expressions a gallery of shock, resentment, and bewilderment. They had been robbed of their spectacle, their righteous vengeance made to look petty and cheap. Without a word, she stepped down from the platform, her legs unsteady beneath her. She followed the straight, purposeful line of Cale's back as he moved through the parted sea of townspeople. No one spoke. No one tried to stop them. The journey to his ranch was a study in silence. He helped her onto the wagon he'd apparently left tethered behind the general store, a simple, sturdy vehicle laden with supplies. He did not touch her more than was necessary. a brief, impersonal pressure on her elbow to steady her. The silence between them was not empty. It was a vast, uncharted territory filled with 1,000 unspoken questions. Who was this man? Why had he done this? What did he want from her? The fear that had receded in the face of her miraculous rescue began to creep back in, a different kind of fear now. It was the fear of the unknown, of a debt so large she could never hope to repay it. As the wagon wheels rumbled, leaving the suffocating confines of redemption behind, the landscape began to change. The cramped, dusty streets gave way to rolling hills, then to vast open plains that stretched to the horizon. The sky seemed to grow larger, the air cleaner. The oppressive judgment of the town was replaced by the immense, indifferent tranquility of the wilderness. It was a visual metaphor for the journey her own soul was taking, from a cramped and airless prison to a terrifying, wide-open freedom. She watched Cale as he handled the reins, his movements economical and certain. He seemed as much a part of this landscape as the hawks circling in the endless sky, or the tough, resilient grasses that bent in the wind. He was still a mystery, a man of profound and unnerving stillness, but as they traveled further into his world, the fear began to be tempered by a fragile, tentative curiosity. Cale's ranch was not a grand estate like Silas Croft's, with a looming main house and rigidly ordered fields. It was a part of the land itself, nestled in a shallow valley carved by a winding creek. The house was small, built of dark, sturdy timber and local stone, looking as if it had grown from the earth rather than been imposed upon it. Corrals, fashioned from smooth, weathered pine, held several magnificent horses that watched their arrival with intelligent, liquid eyes. There was a sense of peace here, a quiet harmony that stood in stark contrast to the simmering resentment of redemption. Kyle led her not to a barn or a servant's outbuilding, but to the main house. Inside, it was sparse, clean, and functional. Woven blankets and rich geometric patterns added color to the simple wooden furniture. It smelled of cedar smoke, leather, and dried herbs. He gestured to a small room off the main living area. "This is yours," he said. His voice, after the long silence, seemed startlingly deep. The room was small, but it had a proper bed with a thick quilt, a small washstand, and a window that looked out not onto a dusty street of judging eyes, but onto the vast open plains. It was more than a room. It was a sanctuary. He had given her a space that was hers alone, a courtesy no one in redemption would have ever considered. In the days that followed, a strange, quiet rhythm established itself. Kyle expected nothing from her. He made no demands, issued no orders. He simply went about his work, rising before the sun to tend to his horses in the land. He left food for her on the main table, simple meals of bread, cheese, and dried meat, and a pot of coffee always warm on the stove. He was giving her something she hadn't realized she'd lost: choice. The first few days she remained in her room, a prisoner of her own fear and uncertainty. But the silence of the house was a healing silence, not the suffocating void of her room in town. Slowly she began to emerge. She started by cleaning, a simple, repetitive task that calmed her racing mind. Then she took to watching him from the porch. She watched the way he moved among his horses, his hands and voice gentle, a silent language of trust passing between them. He was a man of immense patience and profound respect for the creatures in his care. One afternoon, he found her watching and simply held out the lead rope of a gentle mare. He didn't speak. He just offered. Tentatively, she took it. He showed her how to brush the horse, his large, calloused hands guiding hers, his touch respectful and brief. He taught her the names of the prairie grasses, the signs of changing weather, the language of the land he so clearly loved. He spoke little, but his actions spoke volumes. He was not her master. He was her teacher. Through these small, quiet interactions, she began to see pieces of his own story. She saw the scars on his knuckles, the deep sadness that sometimes settled in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. She understood that his solitude was not just a preference, but a shield, much like her own. He was a man who had been wounded by the world, and in this small patch of it, he had created a place where things could heal. Weeks turned into a season. The harsh sun of summer softened into the golden light of autumn. Ilara's hands, once soft, were now calloused from work she chose to do. The hollow fear in her chest had been replaced by the steady rhythm of a life she was slowly, tentatively, building for herself. The gray, shapeless dress of her shame had been burned, replaced by practical denim and soft cotton shirts Cale had left for her, things he'd bought on a supply run without comment or expectation. She had learned the horses, the land, and the quiet language of the man who had saved her. But the one question she had never dared to ask still hung between them in the quiet evenings. A silent, powerful ghost. Why? Why had he done it? Why had he spent a fortune on a stranger, a disgraced woman from a town that despised him? The debt he had paid was a tangible thing, but the debt she now felt she owed him was immeasurable, and its unspoken nature was a weight on her soul. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars begin to prick the deep velvet of the night sky, she found the courage. The words were small, barely a whisper on the cool air. "Why did you do it?" He didn't answer right away. He continued to watch the sky, his profile a stoic silhouette against the fading light. For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer, that the question was a wall she should never have tried to scale. But then he spoke, his voice low and reflective. "My mother," he began, and the words seemed to cost him something, "was taken from our people when she was a girl, sold, to a man who thought he could own her spirit because he had paid for her body." He turned his head then and looked at Ilara, and for the first time she saw past the stillness in his eyes to the ancient, profound grief that lay beneath. "He was wrong," Kyle continued, his voice rough with emotion. "He could break her bones, but he could never touch who she was. She taught me that some things cannot be bought or sold. A person's dignity, their fire. When I saw you on that platform, I saw their faces, the same hunger, the same blindness, and in your eyes, I saw my mother's fire. They thought they could put a price on it. They were wrong. It was not a grand declaration of love or a passionate speech. It was something far more profound. It was a simple, shattering truth, a shared history of pain and survival that bridged the chasm between them. He hadn't seen an asset to be acquired or a victim to be pitied. He had seen a reflection of his own history, his own pain, his own defiance. In that moment, the last of her fear dissolved, washed away by a wave of overwhelming, heartbreaking understanding. He hadn't bought her freedom. He had simply recognized that she was already free, and he had paid to make the rest of the world see it. The revelation settled between them, not as a debt settled, but as a foundation laid. The unspoken weight was gone, replaced by a shared understanding that was stronger than any chain of gratitude could ever be. Ilara was no longer the recipient of his charity. She was the inheritor of his mother's legacy of defiance. A quiet partnership began to bloom in the space his confession had created. It was a partnership born not of words, but of shared labor and mutual respect. She rose with him at dawn, the chill air a clean slate. She learned to mend fences, her hands growing sure and competent. She developed an intuitive sense for the horses, anticipating their needs, her presence a calming influence in the stables. He, in turn, began to share more of his world with her. He taught her the Comanche names for the constellations that wheeled above them each night, stories of star people and celestial hunts that painted the darkness with meaning. He showed her which plants could be used for medicine, which for dye, sharing a knowledge that was woven into the fabric of the land itself. The sparse dialogue between them didn't change, but its quality did. The silence was no longer a space of uncertainty, but of comfortable companionship. A shared glance across the corral, a small nod of approval, a faint smile that barely touched the corners of his mouth. These became their language, a communication more intimate and honest than any spoken words. One afternoon, as a storm gathered on the horizon, a powerful stallion spooked, threatening to break through a weakened section of the fence. Cale moved to intercept it, but he slipped on the rain-slicked ground. Without a second thought, Ilara was there. Using the techniques he had taught her, speaking in a low, calm voice, she gentled the panicked animal, her small frame an anchor of resolute calm against the horse's powerful fear. She led it back to the stable, her heart pounding not with fear, but with a fierce, exhilarating sense of her own capability. When Cale stood, brushing the mud from his clothes, he looked at her. The look in his eyes held no surprise, only a deep, profound respect. In that moment, she was not his ward, or his responsibility. She was his equal. The final remnants of the girl on the auction block were washed away by the rain. The woman who stood in her place was strong, capable, and free. She had found her own footing on this wild, open land. She was no longer defined by her father's crime or the town's judgment. Her identity was forged here, in the dust and the wind, in the sweat of honest labor, and in the quiet, steady gaze of the man who had seen the fire within her all along. The future was no longer a terrifying void, but an open horizon, as wide and full of promise as the land that stretched before them.